last Wednesday, we ended Colossians chapter 1, and we got down to around verse 12. Didn't want to go too far because verses 12, 13, and 14 have a lot of things we need to talk about. A lot of things that are going to help us this study. One thing that I wanted to mention to us when we talked about the theme of Colossians, we talked about that was preeminence of Christ, like the completeness of Christ, the completeness of being in Christ. That's really the whole message Paul is writing to these brothers and sisters here. Colossae, let them know nothing else that they ever needed besides God gives them through his Son. Idolatry, paganism, Judaism, not the Buddhism or any other type of religions that started to get a hold in certain areas. Verse 12 says, give thanks to the Father. It says, he is giving thanks to the Father for the saints there. Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance in light. Left last week talking about what does it mean? Qualified. Giving thanks to the Father has qualified us to share inheritance saints. What does it mean then? Talk about it. To be qualified. Is it something that I have to do to become qualified? Or is this something that God gives us so that we can become qualified? It's an interesting thing to think about. When you think about things, if I think about going to maybe a golf club or something, well, I have to qualify a golf club. I've got to be able to do certain things before I get into the golf club. Well, in this case, we've got to think of it giving thanks to God the Father qualified us to share in the inheritance, but how? How? How was it unique to me, or was it unique? Paul says he qualified us. So for us to be qualified then, that qualification has to come through his Son. Right? He gave us his Son. And we'll talk about it later, about the preeminence of his Son, what his Son means and what his Son has done. That's how we're qualified, because he gave his Son through his blood so that we clothed in him, obedience, baptism. That's where we're qualified. Qualified for the inheritance of the Son in light. Light, because verse 13 says, he delivered us from the domain of darkness. Who delivered us from the Well, still talking about the Father. Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the Son. He delivered us from the domain of darkness, transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, forgiveness, sins. So we have been qualified, delivered, have been transferred. Else. Jump in or whatever you need to say, future self. How did we get delivered from the domain of darkness?
One way we were delivered from the domain of darkness, it's through Christ and our obedience to Christ.
Right. That's the only way, isn't it?
Yes.
The only way that we delivered the domain of darkness. Sacrifice. Jesus' blood removed us from that. The Father qualified us to share in that by the giving of his Son, that delivered us from the domain of darkness and transformed us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. Now, where is that kingdom? Transferred us to the kingdom. Look at the tenses of those words. That means that transferred was present or past tense word to the kingdom. Not a kingdom yet to come, is it?
It's a kingdom that exists right now and existed a little bit in the past as well.
Right. It's that type of thing. It's nothing that's in millennials. We have been transferred to when we become obedient, when we rescue darkness, delivered, beloved Son. Verse 14 says, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sin. So where do you have redemption or the forgiveness of sin outside then of this kingdom? Nowhere. Nowhere. That's the qualifier there. In whom? Whom is the whom? Beloved Son. Beloved, have redemption, forgiveness. Really, verses 13 tell us what it means. Verse 12, God the Father qualified us to share in the light by letting us transfer to in whom we, beloved Son, in whom we have redemption and forgiveness of sin. Verse 15. And he is the image of the God, the firstborn of creation. So talking about his beloved Son. So let me ask you this. Ever seen the book image? Quite paradoxical. Think about it. The only thing that you can see is an image. Everything is either a reflection or a refraction of light. That's how we see those types. But this says he is an image or the image of the invisible God. The firstborn of all creation. Remember, talking about the preeminence and the completeness of Christ here. And remember from last week why we were saying that this was important was because although Paul never mentions specifically any type of invading church, Colossae, but there was an undertone of some type of apostasy, heresy going on, and that would be able to creep in, and they were finding them vulnerable.
This statement here, Brett, in Colossians chapter 1, reminds me when Jesus was on earth and they told Jesus to show us the Father. And he said, when you've seen me, you have seen the Father. And so here Jesus is the image of the invisible God. In other words, what God's attributes, God's character, anything that we think of God having in that sense, it's all come through Christ, or we see it through Christ in that sense. So that's how he can be the image of an invisible God, is because you can go back to the book of Exodus. No man has seen God and lived, but you can see Christ, and through him and through his actions and words and so forth is that reflection or that image of God.
And he is the only, the firstborn of all creation. So that means that the imminence of Christ here is being image of God, firstborn creation. Is in verse 17 where it says he the preeminence of Christ. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth. Praise all created by him and for him is before all things together. So, image of Eric mentioned, you can see, I can see you looking at the person, see things, but can you see certain qualities? See sinless. See give somebody, but you can't see actual forgiveness. You can't see the greatness of the well, Christ was then the image of those perfect. Jesus was an image of, not by his appearance, not whether he little muscle, nothing to do with that. Only had to do with the character makeup of this as God, visible. Yes.
I understand that when God created human beings in his likeness.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I think it goes along with some of these. You're created his image. Jared, you can jump. But the image then of knowing right and wrong, having a tough question. But I think it's again one of those things where looking at us, bodies, we don't all look the same. We are in the way that together physically, but perfectness of God creating the creation.
I think Mickey, you've asked a very good question, and I'm not going to pretend to know the answer. I have taken Genesis 1 to, let us make man in our image is the idea of man having a soul and man having, God having emotions, love, anger, all the emotions that we possess, I believe, came from God. Those are God's emotions. Laughter, sorrow, all of this, and then we have that as well. And so God's saying, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, is from that spiritual side and from that emotional side and that type of thing. Oh my, hurry up. So then, but to talk about Christ, then him being the image of the invisible God is a true reflection or a true thing. We would not be a reflection of God in that sense. We're and like I said, there's someone can explain it better than me, but I've taken it as God's given a piece of him to us, that we might have souls, or we might have those things. But Christ is the reflection, true reflection of God himself. So that would be a difference in that image situation. But after the likeness of God and so forth that was a very good question. And I wish I knew more to dig in more.
In Colossians, here, that Christ is the image of the, but it's difficult for us not to think the physical way that he is the image, because Jesus really came to us. He did show us a physical body.
That's right, he did. And the only thing since Christ was God, is the but it is hard.
Yeah.
It's hard for us to imagine an image, seeing it.
Well, could it be? Is it? Maybe that's way, but it can't be a physical, because was God, he ever physical as far as God himself?
The only thing that I know here, Jared's point, that he is not for man to see, so be outside the realm of perception that I would ever have. So even if you could see, what would cause man is to see? And the other thing, verse 15 is visible God. Me, that translation means image seen.
Oh, I agree with Jared. It's got to do with our soul and our actions, kind of a person that we are, and the kind of person that God means to be. I mean, I'm having a little trouble with that too, because I can't remember ever reading or heard about God being big as far as what we know is physical.
By this verse here, I don't think there's physical, nothing physical here. Otherwise, invisible God. Those are good questions.
Brett, it's good for you to answer, to tell us if we can, as human beings, if we can something that is invisible. God, my doctor. We know, like a prophet Moses, and he did see God in some kind of form. Understand? He's a human being. With his eyes, he cannot see anything invisible. Cannot claim that some form.
That form of reasoning, logical.
I don't know, but I was reading on Revelation, and if you all turn to Revelation, and I'm trying to put everything together in my brain right now. Right, but I'm looking at Revelation 1, and I don't know if it's spiritual, but at the pilot, white snow, that's what flame of fire, and with the end, at the transfiguration, the fire, and the other people, and the church also describes the body with head, Christ's head, and then the arms and member and something. I'm beginning. I'm not wanting something. I think that me. I can start God himself. I had a verse that says eyes, ears, here, and here, a foundation now. So I not want to add any to add to that even though he's spirit, I'm not exactly
But
I don't know how to describe it, but correct me if I'm wrong, but in Revelation, Christ, I don't know describing God or Christ, I'm not sure that one, but this one, Revelation 1. Christ or God.
Let me jump in there, JD. And Revelation 1, you can go back really to verse 11 and on down, and it's describing not God, but it's describing Christ in his glorified state. And so these are words of we say symbolism or figurative descriptions, but it's describing Jesus. Is who this is describing in Revelation chapter 1, not as he was on earth, obviously, but in his what's called glorified state, that is from heaven now. And so look here, he says he saw in the midst of golden candlesticks one like to the Son of Man, clothed in garment, and da-da-da. And so right there, his head and his hairs are white, like, well, here's the Son of Man. See, that's talking about Jesus Christ. And so that's who that is here. And you're right about passages that talk about, for example, God's eyes or God's ears. God's ears are not heavy that he cannot hear. There are words like that used for man's benefit. It's not because God has eyeballs and ears, but for our benefit, that we understand that God hears us, God's aware of us, he sees, he's aware. Those terms are used. And it's a big word called anthropomorphism, and but I'll spare you that. But the point is that those words are used for our benefit, that we might understand God's awareness of us. But he is a spirit. John chapter 4, verse 24, God is a spirit. And so he is not a man, nor has he ever been a man. Go ahead, Brett.
Okay. Verse 8. Head of the body, church. And so imminence of head of the body, the firstborn from. What does it mean to be firstborn?
This is a resurrection.
Okay.
First one who raised from the dead.
What now?
The first one who was raised from the dead.
Okay, the first one. Well, was he the
Christ.
Christ was the first raised from the dead, never to die again. That's what it means by firstborn dead.
Yes.
He wasn't the raised from the dead. But
Right.
the difference here, firstborn from the difference.
Oh.
Makes sense?
Can you say that again?
He wasn't the raised from. He raised people. Right? Nikki? Do you agree with that?
He died
raised.
and then God raised him, right? He had to taste it, the dead, to save us.
Okay. So he raised Jairus' daughter.
Yeah.
What was it?
Okay. I know what your
Point.
yeah.
So how then is he? How is he the firstborn from it? How is that?
They will still die again, like Aaron said. And Christ will not die. Spiritually. Have to come here.
Yeah, put him in there. Put him closer there. Any other comments? You understand what it means then? Christ to be firstborn dead. Said it right. First raised physical death. First place, everything. Everything. First Corinthians, look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. First Corinthians, verse 22. For as in Adam all lies, life, but each in his own order, Christ first fruit. After that, those who are Christ at his. Okay, so the firstborn from the dead, so it might come first place. That's just, again, that's just pointing to the. There's nothing else that these besides they're teaching. Verse 19 says, for it was the Father's pleasure, all the fullness, through reconcile all things. He's through the blood of his. I say, whether or things in heaven. Besides the things that are mentioned, what else could there possibly? All things, the blood of his earth, nothing new. All possibilities are made bare. That's what's through him reconciled the Father's good pleasure for all the full. That our Hebrew study several years. Now, angels were not that they weren't important. Talk about the vast importance of Jesus as compared to some prophets, angels, some of the patriarchs. And this here is it. All things, Father's good pleasure, all the fullness is fullness. It's full, it's full. All the fullness well in. We've transitioned away, starting around 12, 8, Paul, reading to the Colossians, now going into this most like a most written as a way of glorifying, showing glory to God, like away from the kind of the subject glorification of Christ. And in verse 21 it says here, although you engaged in that he has now reconciled, especially by death, in order to for him, that is what we talked earlier about qualifications. Qualified. This is example qualified through him. It says, although you were formerly engaged in dark, yet you've been reconciled, transferred, rescued. What other word? Qualified? That he has now reconciled you in his flesh body, death. Or reconciled his flesh, death. Who's dead? Death. Blood is blood that poured from his flesh. Otherwise, his blood, his blood, that tree would not be.
And then you talked earlier about being qualified, getting ready to be, make us, to be called a child of God.
So what does it mean then to be? It says there that we are reconciled to death, brethren, for him, holy and.
But just like you were saying a bit ago, it's not conditions. Like if talking about being qualified for a sports team or something like that, is there not conditions that you have to meet in order to be qualified?
Yes.
And that's what I was getting to, here.
Yeah. Well, verse 23 is going to.
Yes. Yes.
Here's the problem. If indeed steadfast, not move away.
Yes, so there's something we're going to have to do here to be qualified.
It's scary. We know this. We know that we know that we can go away from that. We're always going to be our sinful nature is. That's not what he's saying. Nothing more clear. Can be reconciled, especially by death, or to for him, holy and honor. If indeed do these, if indeed you are. I think this goes to the crux. I think apostasy. I think this first chapter. This is what hammer down. Only need nothing else. Nothing as important in their life for salvation. They can't shy away from their faith, away from the because that they also were. Let's go
verse 20. Verse 23, does that not kind of debunk the ideal of what they'd always say?
Yes, I think other things, yeah, but very good point. So verse 20, continue faith firmly, steadfast, which was creation, heaven, which was made another train. Where Paul's master he has suffered. Him was a behalf of any. How did they? All teach them?
They were preached.
Preach. All preach.
Paul had never mentioned it. Had never mentioned it.
Hey, got before, remember? They hear. Got Epaphras there in verse 7. Okay, from verse 24. Was there in verse 23 was for all creation. Our maps last week showed you where verse 20. Now I rejoice my flesh here on which is lacking. So is he that with Christ?
Mine says that a little different.
Read what yours.
Who now rejoice in my sufferings for you and fill up that which is behind of Christ. My flesh for his body's sake.
Okay.
So I don't know. I was trying to figure that one out myself. Really what it just coming after Christ or after part of it. You know, I didn't hardly know how to make that.
I don't think Paul lacking. There. Christ is no longer all the for Christ was rejoice in my flesh. Afflictions, just because I afflictions was taking those that Christ didn't do it with. Saying there is taking up suffering and those.
Paul has always been someone who, if you look at his life, he persecuted the church for so many years. He's always been one who's basically said, anything that I suffer, I deserve. Anything that I go through, I'm going to take willingly and not complain because I know that I deserve this. And so whenever I read this, and mine reads about like Tracy's, to fill that up which is behind of the afflictions of Christ, Christ's affliction that he suffered on the earth was complete. I mean, it was filled to the top so far as what he suffered by men through 3 years of preaching and then at the cross and everything else. But I take this to be Paul saying, not that Christ lacked, but I'm picking up the slack because of what I lack. I'm suffering now the afflictions of Christ in my flesh. In other words, I'm suffering for the cause of Christ. So I now rejoice in my sufferings and fill up that which is lacking, or fill up which is behind, of Christ, the afflictions of Christ. In other words, I'm suffering because of Christ, not because of wrongdoing, but because of Christ, for his body's sake. In other words, and so what he shows here is the focus that I'm willing to suffer however I need to suffer for the church. And you'll see this here, you'll see it in Corinthians, you'll see it Ephesians, Timothy, Book of Acts, just over and over and over, how much he did suffer. And whenever he did, he said, when it was for the cause of Christ, he took it willingly. He said, this is what I deserve. And so I think really that's where this is coming from. It's not a lack of Christ affliction. It's him saying, I'm picking up for my lack. I've been a persecutor for a long time, and now I'm going to be persecuted, and that's what I'm going to take. And I'll take it willingly for his body's sake, which is the church.
Philippians, if we talked about that were letters that were Philippians. We look at Philippians in verse, I may know him, resurrection, death, and dead. May know of his resurrection. His saying, filling up, lacking, affliction. Christ, lacking, hated. That's how he goes according to the resurrection. He said, voices in my. I said,
Hang on. I had to look at my clock. I've been into this Bible study myself, Brett. It is 5 till 8 o'clock.
You know what? Specifics change to penance, hearing the gospel, confession, qualified, talking about Colossians, those things might be part of paying him. Transformed in light. So if any action is to be as put on Christ, first step is to be baptized. You need to talk with Jared. Jared doesn't need to. Where we can take care of the things that are taken care of. But those are the reasons called to main things that God gave us. Obedient to. There are those that need baptism in the gospel. Are you going to sing a song?
I can get my mic on. Yeah, I'm going to sing. I think we're ready now.
Next.
Number 319. This step.